The holiday dinner was held in a tense, even slightly nervous atmosphere. Everyone sat around the table, hiding behind forced smiles and trying to maintain casual conversations. Outside the windows, the cold autumn night unfolded, with the wind tapping at the glass, and the darkness seemed thicker than usual. It felt as though it was watching them, hiding something or someone. References to the past came up spontaneously. Someone casually mentioned an old event, and their faces clouded. Suddenly, the room was filled with heavy, awkward silence. Each of them recalled how, on that terrifying night 10 years ago, they had become accomplices to a secret that was better left unspoken. They were young, carefree, drunk on life and alcohol. No one thought that evening could end in something terrible. But what happened should never have happened. They were on the outskirts of the forest when an argument with one of their new friends, someone they had just brought into their group, escalated into violence. At first, it seemed like an accidental dispute, but when one of them pushed him, he fell, hitting his head on a stone. Panic, pain, and despair filled his eyes. He clutched his stomach, blood flowing between his fingers, but he still begged, "Please, don't leave me." But they just stood there, frozen, as he convulsed, gasping for air. Someone turned away, not wanting to see, but the sounds were impossible to ignore. His moans tore through the night's silence, and his eyes, filled with terror, silently begged for mercy. Then one of the friends whispered, "If he survives, they'll arrest all of us." The decision was made. One of them pulled out a knife. They all watched, mesmerized, as the cold blade slowly, methodically, sank into his body. Their hands trembled, their hearts stopped. But it wasn't quick, it wasn't humane. He fought to the last breath, and they stood over him, frozen like statues. The look in his eyes before death was filled with hatred and a promise. "We couldn't leave him alive," someone said, but their voice cracked. Suddenly, everyone heard a strange rustling. One of the friends, noticing something on the table, nervously reached for an envelope lying between the glasses, as if it had appeared from nowhere. His hands trembled as he opened it. He pulled out photographs. On each one was the face of one of them, and on the back, in red, almost blood-like writing, was a simple sentence: "You will all die." The air in the room grew heavy, like after a storm, and the wind hit the window again, as though trying to break the glass. Someone shuddered. Another began to gasp for air, like in a panic attack. All eyes turned suspicious. "You did this to scare us," shouted one of the friends, pushing the man sitting next to her. "No, you've always been the most scared," another rasped, hiding behind the others. From deep within the house, a faint groan was heard, like a muffled voice wandering through the corridors. Their hearts started to race wildly. Someone ran to the doors, but they were locked. Locked from the inside. Their own fears, which they had so carefully hidden over the years, had gathered in one place, returning everything they had forgotten, trying to erase what they had tried to bury from their memories. Paralyzed with terror, they realized this night wouldn't end until each of them felt what true revenge was. The windows were tightly shut, just like the doors, which someone had been unsuccessfully trying to open. The room was silent, too silent, and the only sound was the heavy breathing of the friends filling the air. They all sat tense, their eyes meeting occasionally, but quickly looking away. Paranoia hung in the air like a poisonous gas, slowly poisoning their thoughts. "I don't like this," Alice muttered, shaking her hands as though trying to warm herself, though the room was warm enough. "It's just some stupid prank," Travis said, trying to sound confident, but his voice trembled. Suddenly, James, who had been silent until then, straightened up sharply. His face was pale, and his eyes were darting back and forth. I need to say something." He swallowed and licked his lips as though they had gone dry. "I saw someone outside, just a few minutes ago." The room froze. "What?" Alice turned to him sharply. "Are you kidding?" "No, this was before we found the photos." James looked terrified. "I saw a silhouette. It was standing right by the window, staring at us." "Why didn't you say anything?" Travis shouted, jumping from his seat. His voice echoed off the walls, but no one answered. After a few seconds of tense silence, Lisa, who was sitting closest to the window, cautiously peered through the blinds. The street was empty. No movement, no sound. Only the cold wind shaking the bare branches of the trees. "There's no one out there," she said, stepping back. But her voice was as unsure as their thoughts. "We need to check outside," Travis said. He was the bravest of their group, but now even he looked scared. The group gathered, armed with whatever they could find. A kitchen knife, a heavy metal candlestick, and James even found an old poker. Slowly and carefully, they opened the door and stepped outside. The night was dark and damp, the wind piercing through them, carrying the smell of wet earth and decaying leaves. They split up to check the house. Every step on the damp earth made a soft crunch, and every sound felt too loud. "Maybe it's all in our heads?" Lisa muttered, spinning around. Suddenly, Alice screamed. Everyone rushed to her, but by the time they reached her, she was on her knees, holding her mouth. On the ground lay a dead bird. Its wings were twisted, and its body was mutilated as if someone had intentionally hurt it. A small note was stuck to its beak. Shaking, Travis took the note and unfolded it. It read, "Birds are silent before the storm. You will be silent too." "What the hell?" he whispered, looking around. Suddenly, their phones all rang at the same time. They jumped, startled by the unexpected sound, and quickly answered. They all received the same message. "When the silence becomes eternal, I will come for you." "This is just a game," James nervously laughed, but his laugh sounded unnatural. One of us set this all up." "Shut up," Alice snapped, listening to the surrounding sounds. In the distance, something creaked, maybe a gate. "We need to go back to the house," Lisa said firmly. They turned back, but inside, there was no sense of safety anymore. Every room seemed cold and hostile, as if the house itself was watching them. On the kitchen table, where their plates had once been, was now a knife with a blade glistening with something red. "Who did this?" Lisa screamed, but there was no answer. Another message appeared on their phones. "The more you hide, the closer the end becomes." Each of them realized this was not a game, and it wasn't one of them. Someone was here, someone was watching them, and that someone knew exactly what they had done 10 years ago. The room was filled with tense silence, broken only by heavy breathing and sporadic gasps. After the discovery of the knife and the notes, the atmosphere thickened, as if the air in the house had turned suffocating. Travis, gripping a metal poker, stepped closer to Alice. "This can't be a coincidence," he shouted. His eyes were wide with fear and anger. "One of us did this. Someone wants us to break." Alice, irritated, rubbed her face and spun around sharply. "Enough shouting. If you know something, you'd better tell us now." Suddenly, James, who had been sitting in the corner holding his head, broke the silence. "You want the truth? Fine, I'll say it." He stood up, his face pale. "I pushed him. Back then it was me." Everyone froze. "What?" Lisa's eyes widened. "What did you say?" James looked like he was about to vomit. "We had an argument. I didn't mean... It was an impulse." He fell. "It all happened so fast." "But you said it was an accident." Alice screamed, her voice trembling. "We all stayed quiet because we thought it wasn't your fault. You all decided to stay silent," James shouted back. His voice echoed in the empty room. "You convinced me it was better this way." Travis threw the poker to the floor, his face tight. "I stayed quiet too." He lowered his head. "I saw you push him, but I decided it was better to stay silent." "You all knew," Lisa screamed, her voice tearing through the tense atmosphere. "You knew, and I stayed quiet too. We're all guilty." The tension was rising, like the room was about to explode. But suddenly, the lights in the house went out. Darkness enveloped them like a thick black fog. All they could hear were screams and the sound of someone knocking over a table and falling. "Who's there?" Alice yelled. "Stick together." Travis shouted. Lisa, holding her phone, turned on the flashlight. The light cut through the darkness, revealing the anxious faces of her friends. They were all close to each other, but one was missing. "Where's James?" Alice whispered. They looked around, but no one was visible. "James?" Lisa's voice was weak. Suddenly, a strange sound came from the next room. A faint rustling, like footsteps on the wooden floor. Their hearts froze. "We need to check," Travis said, but his voice was no longer as confident as before. Slowly, the flashlight illuminated their path. Each step was unnervingly loud in the eerie silence. They reached the door to the room and paused. Lisa was the first to go in. Her phone light illuminated the center of the room, and she screamed. On the floor lay James's body. His eyes were wide open, but lifeless. His throat was slit, and the word traitor was carved into his chest with a knife. Blood spread across the floor, creating a gruesome pattern. Alice covered her mouth with her hands, her body trembling. "This can't be real." Travis looked around. "One of us did this," he whispered, then raised his voice. "Someone among us killed him." "It wasn't me," Lisa screamed. "It wasn't me. I didn't do anything." "Then who?" Travis looked like he was on the verge of a breakdown. Alice suddenly remembered the message. "You will all die." Her heart clenched in fear. "We can't trust each other," she whispered, stepping back. Their faces were filled with panic and suspicion. The darkness outside the room began to consume them again, and they realized staying here was dangerous, but escaping the house might be even worse. Lisa sat on the floor, hugging her knees, her hands trembling. The room was silent, broken only by the heavy breathing. The light flickered weakly after they found James's body. The atmosphere in the house had become suffocating, fear filling every corner. "We can't stay silent anymore," Travis said, his voice sharp and urgent. "This has gotten out of control. We need to call the police." Alice lifted her head, her eyes filled with both fear and anger. "Police? Are you serious? Do you want them to find out everything? What we did? What difference does it make?" Travis shouted. "Did you see what happened to James? We're all going to die if we don't do something." "He's right," Adam added, who had been silent until then. "Someone is deliberately taking us out. We still don't know who it is." Alice stood up, her face tense. "Maybe it's one of us. Maybe it's you, Travis. Or maybe it's you," he shouted, stepping closer. "Enough." Lisa stood up, her voice cutting through the argument. "We need to stick together. If we start turning on each other, we're just going to get picked off." "It's already happening." Travis threw the metal poker to the floor. "Do what you want, but I'm getting out of here." He stormed out of the room, and the rest of them were left staring at each other in disbelief. Travis walked down the hallway, lighting his way with his phone. His heart was pounding so hard he could barely hear anything around him. The door ahead of him was slightly ajar, and he peeked inside. Suddenly, something crashed behind him. He spun around, but saw only an empty hallway. His breathing grew even heavier. "Who's there?" he whispered. There was no answer, but the sound of footsteps grew louder. Travis ran toward the exit but tripped and fell. When he looked up, a figure wearing a mask stood before him. Travis screamed, but the attacker quickly dragged him into a dark corner. His screams faded, and after a few minutes, the hallway fell eerily silent again. In the living room, Alice, Lisa, and Adam sat in tense silence. Suddenly, they heard Travis's scream. "What was that?" Alice gasped, jumping to her feet. Adam rushed to the door, but Lisa stopped him. "Don't go. Could be a trap." "We can't just sit here," he said, pulling away. Adam quickly moved through the corridors, searching for Travis. But when he found him, he realized it was too late. Travis lay on the floor, his throat slashed, a symbol of scales carved into his forehead. Adam recoiled, feeling his body freeze in terror. He turned to run, but the attacker was already behind him. A brief sound of air tearing, and then everything went quiet. Alice and Lisa were left in the room, their panic at its peak. "They're dead," Alice whispered. "They're all dead." "You don't know that," Lisa replied, trying to stay calm. "We can still make it out." But when Alice stood to head toward the kitchen, the door suddenly slammed shut. She looked back at Lisa. "Did you do this?" "What? No." Lisa jumped up. Suddenly, the lights went out again, and a chilling rustle filled the darkness. Alice screamed, but her scream quickly died. When the lights returned, Lisa saw her friend lying on the floor, a knife in her chest and the word traitor carved into her arm. Lisa stood alone in the empty room, gasping for breath. Her eyes searched for an exit, but then a figure appeared before her. "Who are you?" she screamed. The attackers slowly removed their mask, and Lisa gasped. "You? But how? You all betrayed me," he whispered, stepping closer. "And now you're all going to pay." Lisa realized she was next. She wondered how she was going to survive this nightmare. Lisa stood before him, her mind struggling to process what was happening. She could feel her legs shaking, her chest tightening with fear, and her breathing growing heavier. The guy standing in front of her was no longer the friend she had known. His face was twisted, not just with pain, but with hatred. His eyes were filled with emptiness, reflecting all the fear and anguish he'd endured that night. "Do you think I forgot?" His voice was low and deep, like the very silence that enveloped the house. "Do you think I forgave you? You think I just walked away from all of that and stayed alive?" Lisa couldn't understand why he was still here, why he was alive. It became all too clear. They had left him in the forest, the same forest where he had been dying, and she, along with the others, had walked away. They walked away, leaving him alone in the dark, not knowing if he would still be breathing, or if anyone would ever find him. She remembered how loudly they had laughed as they left, hearing his screams and pleas. She tried not to think about it, not to listen to those screams in her head. She didn't want to, but he survived. "You left me there, left me to die alone?" His voice cracked, and Lisa began to understand that she had become part of something far more terrifying than she had ever imagined. "I didn't die because I was stronger. You thought it would end, that we'd all forget? You thought I'd forgive you." Lisa coughed, and his words gnawed at her. They still tasted bitter on her tongue, like poison. But he was right. She hadn't just witnessed that horrific night. She had been a part of it. She had been the one to help make it possible. And now he was here in front of her, demanding retribution. "You won't die," he said, gripping her hand so tightly that her fingers throbbed. "But you'll pay for this." He placed a box in her hands, heavy and metallic, and Lisa opened it. Inside were the keys to her house and photos of her family. In the pictures, they were bound, their eyes reflecting the same pain that Lisa felt now. She stared at them, unable to believe it was really her family. "You left them when you came here," he whispered quietly, and Lisa felt a chill run down her spine. "You're guilty. You left me to die, and now they will pay." Lisa stood there, unsure of what to do. At that moment, the screen of her laptop flashed, and Lisa saw a video. It was her family, tied up and kneeling. The video was taken just before they met their deaths. They all looked desperate, every word, every movement filled with hopelessness. Emma, her mother, spoke, pleading for mercy. They were cut and simply left to die, not finished off, but left to suffer in horrific agony. They begged for help, but no one came. In the end, they died in front of Lisa. She knew there was nothing more she could do. It was too late. "Why didn't I kill you?" He stepped closer, his face contorted with rage. "Because you're not worth dying, Lisa. You'll live with this pain, you've lost everything. And that will be your punishment." In his eyes was something Lisa could never comprehend. He hadn't just survived what happened. He realized he had nothing left to lose. She was utterly alone with her guilt. That same night, the police found Lisa in the room, tears on her face, having lost the last thing she had. The girl was left alone with shadows, with guilt that had no end. Like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new mysterious stories. Leave a comment on whether you could forgive yourself for past mistakes. And remember, some things can't be left in the past. They will always catch up with you.